Okay.
Welcome to the third Saturday at the AAGGKY, African American Genealogy Group of Kentucky. We today will have a guest speaker presenter, and Denise Payton will introduce her in a minute. We have one additional announcement to make that the group will participate with Ashland at the Living History presentation workshop type deal in Lexington next Saturday from 10 till 5, I think it is. So just keep an eye out in our on our website for some more information on that. I'd like to invite all of you to attend any and all of our meetings. Our membership fee annual is $30, and if you pay by card or whatever, we have just a $1 handling fee. Group rates are $50. And I don't have anything else here, but Denise will do the introductions. And if does anyone else have any announcements? Okay, don't forget to put your address, not your address, but at least your name and wherever you're zooming in from in chat, because we're going to start keeping a map. We go from coast to coast,
Yeah.
and east to west, so it's really interesting to see who's joined in with us today. Okay, Denise, take it away.
Okay. Before we get going with Hilliary, in our October 3rd Saturday, we will have Melissa Barker, an archivist. She's in Tennessee, but she's also a member of the Kentucky Genealogical Society. And so she'll be presenting to us on all of the many records that are not online, but can be found in archives. So that should be pretty interesting. And then in November, we have a hybrid meeting. Frank X. Walker will be speaking to us, and it will be actually take place at the Boone County Public Library. So we invite all of you who can attend in person to do so, or to join us via Zoom. So we're really looking forward to that. He's going to have some books there, and I'm sure he'll sign those for us. So we're looking forward to that. Yeah, we're looking forward to that. Boone County Library has really been working to assist us in presenting this hybrid presentation. So for today, Hilliary Delaney is joining us. She serves as the lead researcher for the African Americans in Boone County History Initiatives at Boone County Public Library's Archive and History Center. She has documented hundreds of Underground Railroad incidents and genealogical data for thousands of individuals once enslaved in Boone County and across Kentucky. Projects developed from this work include the Underground Railroad in Boone County bus tour. It's a National Park Service Network to Freedom program. Historic roadside markers in Indiana and Kentucky, African American cemetery documentation in Boone County, the African Americans in the Kentucky Borderlands database, and the Legacy of Enslaved Mothers short film project. Her work has received local, regional, and national recognition. Her presentation today is entitled Escape: Boone County's Underground Railroad History Rediscovered. So welcome, Hilliary.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I will go ahead, if you're ready, I'll go ahead and share my screen. I'm so excited to be here with you all today. I'm pleased to be with some people who already know how to do some genealogy. I did a version of this same presentation for another group, just a general open to whoever would like to come presentation. And I found myself stopping and explaining things a whole lot more than I need to with you all because you all are a genealogy group. So that's doing me a great service, I'll tell you. Well, we'll go ahead and get started. I wanted to call attention to the fact that Rediscovered is in our title. I don't claim to have found these so much as rediscovered the information around these escapes. I do think many of these were known locally, but sort of lost to time, particularly when people moved out of the area who were connected to the freedom seekers who escaped from Boone County. Those stories just kind of dissolved as people went on their way. This screen kind of shows you this circle that I've put on the tri-state area. We call that our borderlands here because we are the northernmost county in what was a border state, and that Ohio River spans a lot of our border that we share with both Indiana and Ohio, which of course, were free states during the time of enslavement. And so I wanted to start by talking about rethinking what the Underground Railroad means. So we've all probably heard that kind of general definition of a network of people and places and routes and this whole system that helped enslaved people escape to freedom before the Civil War, which is kind of a general definition. I tend to scoop in a whole lot more than what is traditionally covered as the Underground Railroad, in quotation marks, because I think that many escapes happened at the prompting of the freedom seekers themselves, and they're often left out of that storytelling. And I think particularly that some of those early escapes that we know occurred as early as the county was here, because as soon as enslavers brought enslaved people here, of course, there were escapes because people want freedom. That's the nature of people. And so I think that the sort of the mythology around the Underground Railroad developed to sort of include that very well-known and orchestrated effort to get people to freedom where there are safe houses and conductors and everything's identified. But I do think that there was a more organic development of that occurred earlier. And that was really driven by the freedom seekers themselves, who are often, as I said, not really acknowledged for their role in their own escape. So I think it's important that we do that. When we talk about the Underground Railroad, I know that when Rachel and Jeff came on our tour, what draws people to these tours in a lot of cases is this kind of mythology, and it's a storytelling tour, and people are really interested, and I'm glad that they are, because that's one of the inroads to talking about enslavement itself. And we can get people to come out, and we want people's ears. We want people to listen and understand how important this history is, and that helps us to share it. But I think sometimes, at least some of the stories that I've heard in the past, and maybe even told in the earliest days of my doing this work, I focused, or other interpreters focused, on the escape more than the freedom seekers themselves. And I think finding their humanity and talking about them as people and identifying that these are not just stories, these are people's lives. And that's so important when we talk about the Underground Railroad, or any instance where we're talking about human beings. We need to talk about the human beings involved. And so that's a goal of mine, and I hope I do it justice today. I know that the Underground Railroad, the basis of that is the assistance of these freedom seekers and giving them assistance to freedom. But the people giving the assistance were a lot more wide-ranging than what has been documented historically, and there's good reason for that. In some cases, it's because people's names weren't known. In many cases, the African Americans who were doing this work on the Underground Railroad, their names were left out in some cases to protect them. And this even includes some of those published works by, Levi Coffin's reminiscence of slavery. He doesn't name people sometimes, and I think that's on purpose. He leaves a blank because that autobiography was written not too long after emancipation, a generation maybe. And so people still were vulnerable to retaliation. But I also think that assistance being done by African Americans who worked on the Underground Railroad is one thing, but there's also assistance being done by enslaved people to help other enslaved people. And that's really hard to document, but we do know of a few cases here in Boone County where there were people who were had enough freedom of movement who were enslaved, who didn't leave themselves because of various reasons, including they didn't want to lose connections with their families. People's families were often used as a bargaining chip by enslavers to say, you better not leave, or, you know, there's going to be a separation there. And so it's really hard to document those people because their identities were not well known, but also, you know, again, very dangerous. When an enslaved person chooses to help another enslaved person to freedom, that's not just assistance, that's also resistance. And the very act of a freedom seeker making the decision, even considering the decision to leave, was a huge risk, right? And that's the biggest form of resistance that they can act upon at that point, outside of, you know, committing murder. You know, I mean, there were, you know, or an uprising, or something very drastic and very publicized. But thinking about leaving is a form of resistance, because the seed is planted, and we really, you know, as human beings, all want to live free. And so I think that is a form of resistance. And then the borderlands of slavery that I referred to on that opening slide, our geography is important in this discussion. We sometimes get questions when we do tours about why people didn't just cross the river and leave. That's a kind of naive question if you don't think about it really long and hard. But I can understand why people who are standing, you know, on the riverbank and looking right across the river and thinking, well, gosh, why didn't they just go? It's so complicated to answer that, because it's dangerous, because there were so many leverage points in place that enslavers would use to keep people. Like I mentioned, people's families being sold south is a big one. There's also, you know, the enslavers were using the Bible to keep people in place. The enslavers were using all forms of emotional blackmail. Also, trust, telling people that anyone who says they're going to help you, they're not going to help you. They're going to kidnap you and sell you south. Don't trust any of those people. So it really is a terrifying thing to think about crossing that river and not coming back for a lot of reasons. So our geography is important in that we were close to free states. We're right across the river, but it also didn't mean it made it easier. It's just closer. It's a shorter trip, but it's just as dangerous. The politics here were very intense. We had periods of time where the amount of patrollers on the river on the Kentucky side were doubled and tripled when an escape occurred. But I also know that the orchestrated version of the Underground Railroad that was very organized, there was usually one person in charge of almost, gosh, I don't even know how many miles, but from, if you look at the map, if you look at Kentucky, from Boone County, follow that river all the way down to Henderson, right across the river from Evansville, there was somebody on that Indiana side that ran the show. And what that means is it was that organized, that one person had that huge a chunk of geography to keep their eye on. They had lots of people working for them. That position changed hands a lot, but it was that organized. And that's really interesting to learn that, because I think today we have so much technology that we think that it couldn't possibly have been as organized as we can be with picking up a phone or looking at a computer. But I beg to differ. But the enslavers were also organized, which is something that I talk about a lot in some of these presentations, that they worked very hard to keep the Underground Railroad's activity at bay through politics mostly. So the idea of being sold south, as I mentioned, for enslaved people in the Upper South, that was a terrifying, probably one of the worst outcomes that you could learn if it were to happen to you. Because it's separation of family, and also the conditions are so much more brutal in terms of the climate and the work that was being done. That is not to say that being enslaved in the Upper South was a cakewalk. It was not. People that were enslaved here in Boone County usually were one of a handful of people that were enslaved by one enslaver. And that meant often that they did everything. And there's a level of intimacy that is very uncomfortable there, because that person is almost always under the eye of the enslaver, because the properties weren't as big and everybody knew who you were and where you were supposed to be. So it's a different kind of discomfort, but being sold south was a near-death sentence for people because that was a churning machine, and bodies were just being thrown at that work, and people often died as a result of that system. It was terrible. And so the enslaved people knew that, and like I said, enslavers often used the fear of being sold south to keep people in line. So if that is a prompt for people escaping, I like to look at the before, during, and after process that kind of materialized when I was looking at some escape ads. Before, if you look to the right, these people that are mentioned in this ad were to be sold to the South. These two men, Tom and Hiram. And the man who was looking for them was named O.W. Gaines. He is listed in the article as being from Georgetown, but he was up and down the Ohio. He was related to the Gaines family here in Boone County, which included the Gaineses, who were the enslavers of Margaret Garner and her children. And so O.W. Gaines is, he was in Georgetown, but he was also in Arkansas. And he was a slave trader. He took enslaved people up and down the river all the time. And this ad right here, the tone is interesting. It was run in Rising Sun, which is right across the river from Rabbit Hatch here in Boone County. And they have a disapproving sort of tone of what he's doing. But some of it, I'm laughing because it's not for the right reasons. They are basically saying, why is our bank lending him $50,000 for buying humans and selling them when they could be giving that to our farmers? It's a really strange sort of tone to that. But they also did not, in the border states, didn't like the attention that escapes and slave trade brought to their towns. And that had some negative repercussions for freedom seekers at times. But these men here escaped from this slave trader before they even were put on a boat. This during ad, if you look to the left of the screen, in 1834, this ad ran in a newspaper in Mississippi, in Vicksburg, and the jailer of Vicksburg was putting an ad in because he had captured a man named Manuel. And he claimed to be enslaved by John Shaver of Boone County, and John Shaver was in Boone County. I think John Shaver probably sold Manuel, and he was sent south. And he was actually caught on a steamboat, captured in the South. He probably was being sold and escaped en route, and then got on a different steamboat and was trying to make his way back home to his family, but was captured there. And then after, if you look down in the bottom left, a man named Stephen Tickle, who was of Wilkinson County, Mississippi, which is about 30 miles from Natchez. And if you're familiar with the Fork in the Roads slave market, it was a huge site, terribly well known for all the horrible reasons. But on our tour that Rachel and Jeff were on, we talked about this man that I underlined in this article, George Washington Brasher, who was a Boone County, and he was a state legislator at one point. He was wealthy. He was also a slave trader, which is where a lot of his wealth came from. And it states that these men that they are looking for, George and Edmund, were recently purchased from George W. Brasher, probably at Fork in the Roads. And so these men escaped directly after being auctioned to the Stephen Tickle, and they were gone. They never got to, at this point anyway, never got to the plantation where he was intending for them to be working. So, as I mentioned, Boone County has, I think it's about 42 miles of river border. A great portion of that is Indiana, but right at the top of that big hump on the top of the county is split down the middle between Ohio and Indiana if you go across the river. So we border free states for that huge span of 42 miles. And when you think about what that means in our position in the state being the northernmost county, it's kind of the last stop if people came through that route. So we had people coming from points south of Boone County and east, southeast, southwest, direct south, who may have not even known where they were when they were coming through the county. So what we are often asked is who was helping here, because there are some documented cases of people getting assistance within the county, but usually those details are very hard to find because of the nature of enslavement and the retaliation that would occur upon anyone who helped. It would be different for the white people who lived here than it would be for a free Black person or an enslaved person who might help somebody. Much harsher penalties for them. But for the white people, they would suffer retaliation in other ways, like social ways. They would lose either business or friends or kicked out of the church, or in physical ways where their barn would be burned. There were some consequences. So it's harder to find those people and identify them. Although we do know who held public anti-slavery views within the county. So that being said, people didn't just escape from here, they escaped through here. And there was a lot of pressure to keep people enslaved within the county, which meant, double and tripling the patrollers, as I mentioned, but that would also affect people coming through the state that didn't know when that was happening and didn't know not to go right through this town. People got caught in Petersburg frequently, and they were almost always people who were not from Boone County because they didn't know where they were. So if you look at that ad that I placed on this slide, this man, not even a man, he's a boy, he's 17 years old. He was escaping from an enslaver, Samuel Red, who was in Lexington. And if you see, I've highlighted that he was spotted below Gaines Tavern, and Gaines Tavern was right on the Lexington-Covington Road, which we now know as Dixie Highway or US 25. And that was a main route. The Gaines Tavern was owned by Abner Gaines at the time of this escape in 1824. Abner Gaines was the enslaver of Margaret Garner's mother, and Margaret was probably born there at Gaines Tavern. And Gaines is in Walton, which is near the southern end of the county. So coming directly up that road from Lexington, he would have passed right by Gaines Tavern. Now, typically people would not go on the busiest, essentially a highway. It was a stagecoach route at that point. A lot of people would go parallel to that so that they wouldn't get caught, but using that as a guide to get them to Covington and then Cincinnati. But when this man was spotted, he was in the company of two men, and they described those men as well. And what I wonder through this is, were those men with him the whole way, or did he pick them up along the way and they were helping him get through Boone County? So all these things sort of help us understand what was happening here in this area. Now, humanizing the people involved in the Underground Railroad, including the people who weren't doing the right thing, I think is important in part of the storytelling. But when I say storytelling, it makes it sound like it's fiction, and it's not. It's nonfiction. These are people's lives. And this graphic that I put together is sort of a visual representation of how I think we need to move to that. There's a little word salad on the left there that has all the words we use when we talk about the Underground Railroad and enslavement and escapes. And that is sort of faded into this man's face. And this man, we're lucky to have a picture of him. He's actually somebody who escaped from Boone County. So this is an actual real person, and we see his image. I'll talk about him in a little while, but it's pretty rare that we have a picture, a photograph of a freedom seeker. And so we're real lucky to have come across this photo that helps us to understand him and learn about him in different ways. So I'm going to start humanizing some of these stories with you. And I'm going to start with the one that I have the least amount of information about this individual. But the minute I discovered an ad offering a reward for him, he really seemed so interesting because his personality comes through. Even though these ads are not written in a way that that's supposed to be the case, they are descriptive. So this man's name was Mood or Moody. He's referred to as Moody in some sources, but he ran away in September of 1813 from Elijah Kirtley. Elijah Kirtley placed this ad a year later, and he was still gone. The Kirtley family is well known in Boone County, and they had a really important role in the establishment and the early days of Bulletsburg Baptist Church, which is our mother Baptist church here in the county. And it predates Boone County. So it was established in the early 1790s, around there. And I think it's funny that a Kirtley family member would also be a tavern keeper, but we do have those Baptists that drink, so or serve the drinks in this case. But Mood was in this ad described, of course, they give a physical description of him between 25 and 30. I highlighted some things that he was very, very strong and often boasts of his strength and fond of gambling. Now, that's a little insight into at least this enslaver's impression of him. But the boastfulness to me shows a level of confidence, right? And shows a level of self-assuredness that this man may have had. And that's at least the sort of the image that I'm getting of his personality from that comment. There are some painful things that are part of the description, including the fact that he was branded on one of his hands by either a coin or a ring, something circular that was heated and then burned into his skin because he had escaped previously. And he was embarrassed by this. I think that part is blocked, but he often hid that from view because he didn't want people to see it. And that's an awful thing to see. And it gives us insight. He also had a lot of scars that were noted in this ad that he had a lump the size of a bullet is the way they describe it. I don't know if that means it was, it was caused by a bullet, but it was in his chest. He had several scars on his shoulder. One was very long. They describe his clothing and some of it that we can't see. It's a little bit blocked, but gives you kind of an idea of what he would have looked like, and that helps us to humanize him. This is very early, so even if there was a photograph, there wouldn't have been a photograph. So we don't have a visual of him. But Mr. Kirtley is advertising for his return. And that was the first bit of information I had about Mood. Well, I found him again in the Boone County Recorder, which began in 1875. So this is after the end of enslavement. And so we have many years of this newspaper, but there are articles and bits of information that talk about enslavement in the county. And there was a man who wrote a letter that was published in 1877, and it included his memories. And he said this was about 55 years earlier, his memories of Burlington. And he talks about Elijah Kirtley, who kept the principal tavern. So his tavern was right behind the courthouse. So it was a busy place, and especially during court days. And so this man goes on to say that those living who patronize the tavern will remember Moody because he was memorable, right? The slave of Kirtley who had the reputation of being the smartest, and I'm not saying the word, and greatest scoundrel in Kentucky. Now, it sounds a little bit like he's insulting him, but I really think it's supposed to show that, oh, he's such a scoundrel. He was probably in contact with the people who came to the tavern very regularly. He may have been a bartender or a barkeep of some sort. And the fact that he's a gambler, well, who is he gambling with? He's gambling with people who come to the tavern. So he's really having social contact with these people and making an impression that was enough of an impression that this man is talking about him, 50 plus years later. And then just a couple years ago, I found this. There was an ad for Moody, and he was listed as 37. Remember, it was 25 to 35 before. Now it's 37. This is actually 1821, so that tracks pretty well with the timing of the 1814 ad. At this point, he has left enslavers Lewis B. Fenwick and Moses Clinton, who were from Frankfort, and they had purchased Moody from Elijah Kirtley. So what we know is prior to 1813, in that first ad, Moody was described as having a burn on that hand because he had escaped. So he had escaped earlier, and then he was with Kirtley after the ad was placed. He had been gone for a year and somehow had gotten returned to Kirtley and probably stayed with Kirtley until he was sold to these two men. So looking at that timeline, that kind of gives you an understanding of Moody and how focused he was on getting his freedom. He left these two, and I began to look to see who are they. When it's a partnership, it's usually a business, and it turns out that they actually owned a tavern, so it makes sense. So he was probably sold to them as a skilled person to work in a tavern. So he would know the ins and outs of that business and know how to entertain and serve these people, probably again as a barkeep or something. So they mentioned that he will probably stop in Boone County, where he was lately purchased. So pretty soon after he was sold, he took off again And gosh, I hope he got free and stayed free. But I thought it was interesting that the reward that was offered for him 7 years later was double of what, or no, I'm sorry, 5 times what it was when Kirtley offered it. So that's a pretty good indication that he was considered a valuable person in terms of these businesses, which again, I bet you he had a great personality, because dealing with that kind of business, you kind of have to charm people like crazy. So I hope Moody made it. Now, moving on to Mr. Terrell. This escape and the last one that I'll tell you about, there were these long articles that were written about these men. And so that's why I wanted to make those available, because I can't take the time to read the whole thing to you, and it's chock full of details. But I just wanted to talk a little bit about my process and how I go through this. So if you've done any sort of reading of old newspapers, you know that enslavement was often romanticized and talked about, especially beginning sometime in the 1880s, 1890s, 1900, around there. These elderly people who were formerly enslaved were being interviewed, whether it was Underground Railroad escape or not. They were being interviewed by newspaper people. And these articles almost always said that this person was 100 years old or older, which I think is so funny, because not everybody is 100 years old. It's often kind of an exaggeration. So in this case, there was this full page article, and you can see the illustration kind of in the background, where it has this, kind of a bad slave hunter guy up on the right, and then a young man running, and then a house, and then there's the face of this older man. And this is all about Joseph Terrell. And they said in this article that he was still alive when this article was run, and they said that he was 105 according to his family. His daughter was interviewed, and he said, no, I'm 115. Well, that's one thing that I want to check, because it's going to make it easier for me to trace him if I know exactly how old he is. But this kind of thing, again, was common. He also claimed that his father was captured by Indians during the French and Indian War. That didn't really track in terms of the timing. So I'll show you later why that is. But that caught my eye. But then he gets into great detail when it comes to his escape. He escaped with 5 sisters and another man. And he talks about, how they were being chased, and then the people that helped them, and someone sent them to an abolitioner in Circleville, Ohio, named Doddridge. Well, that's a clue that I can actually look for, right? So I started taking these little hints and kind of making note of his personality. And he was a very devout man, and that comes through in the article. And if you read it, I think you'll enjoy some of the comments he makes about his faith. But I wanted to go in there and do my thing, which is usually to debunk or prove that some of the claims being made in the article are correct, so that I can then move forward with the research and try to figure out, where he came from. They said he was from Boone County, so I need to learn more. He escaped from a Boone County enslaver, and he is using the name Terrell, which is a family name here in Boone County. So that caught my eye first, and I wanted to look at the Terrell family and see if these details were matching up. So I looked at a timeline based on some of the dates within this article. And he did talk about in the article that the enslaver died, and then he knew that he was going to be sold. And so I looked at who may have died around the time, tracing it backwards with the details from the article. And it looked to me like it matched up with Robert Terrell, who was here in the county. In fact, some of the details, I looked at Robert Terrell's widow to try to figure out, with her tax list, whether there was loss of enslaved people noted in the enumeration there. So Robert Terrell is who I landed on there. So that one panned out pretty well. And then when he talked about the French and Indian War, I can't, got to shake my head. So his birth was at the very earliest, by the claims in the paper, 1793. By the records I found, maybe 1806. So if he was born in 1806, even if his father was very old, it's doubtful that he fought Indians in the French and Indian War, because that was the 1750s. So that would not have happened. But what I did know is that Robert Terrell fought in the War of 1812. And as you all might know, sometimes enslavers took a body man with them when they went to war. So that could be could be like a half and half. No, he was not captured during the French and Indian War. However, he could have been at the War of 1812 with the enslaver, and there may have been some contact with Native Americans during that time. So that story may have some kernel of truth in it, but it's definitely not the French and Indian War. He was helped by a man named Doddridge, he says in the article. I took to the Siebert papers, so Wilbur Siebert, if you all have used him before in any sort of research, he was at Ohio State and he's well known for contacting people who worked on the Underground Railroad, or knew people who worked on the Underground Railroad, or were themselves helped by the Underground Railroad. And he wrote letters and took all these surveys. So it's a wealth of information. It's missing some things, but it is helpful. And I found Philip Doddridge, and he was well documented as an Underground Railroad agent in Circleville, Ohio. So that one was right hitting the nail on the head. I'm thankful that Terrell had such great memory. He did talk about fleeing with 5 sisters and an unnamed male. I do think that the numbers matched up with what I found in tax lists for the widow of Robert Terrell, that she went from having X amount of slaves, I think it was 7, to 0. So they're gone, and the numbers matched up really well. What is undetermined is that it's hard to track down women in genealogy just in general. And the time frame that they escaped, they would have probably married soon after, or were already married maybe, or using a different name. So I haven't tracked them down yet, but I'm still working on it. I think he's probably right in terms of the numbers, though. And again, I said his birth was questionable, but that's okay. Exaggerate it if it makes you feel like you're getting good attention. When I looked at him in the records, though, it looked like his birth date did fluctuate, as is often the case, between 1806 and 1817. So it's off a bit. But I don't begrudge him saying he's 115. If you've lived as long as he did live, then go for it. He did enlist as a soldier when he arrived in Canada. So he got there shortly before a Canadian rebellion that occurred in 1837. And it was a short little military action, but they do have documents, and he was in them. And so that really helped to nail down that part of the timeline and prove when he arrived in Canada. And I do like to say the devil is in the details, but you can either fight the devil or throw in with him, because you got to verify, and you've got to prove or disprove some of these facts in order to move forward with a genealogy approach. So that helps quite a bit. All right. So Joseph Terrell, I do encourage you all to read that article if you have time to do so. It's a little hard to read. If you have trouble with it, get in touch with me, and I'll try to clarify the JPEG of it a little bit for you, or I can even transcribe some of it if you need help with that, because it is really interesting. But I want to move on to the last person that I want to talk about, because I really hit a gold mine with him. He is the guy whose picture we saw. His name is Abram Losford, and the picture actually came from the Howell, Michigan history book. And so he was a fixture in that community, which really helped a lot with the research. But I discovered him again through an article which you can also access, and that was his obituary. And he talked at some point earlier about how he had escaped. And those details are in there. And he escaped around 1849, he said, because his enslaver was deeply in debt. And that's a hint. So that's something I'll want to look at. And the way Boone County, the way people would transfer goods or human chattel from Boone County was a small boat on our side of the river would go to a landing on the Indiana side of the river, because it was more friendly to big boats docking there. And so he already had a clue that they were going to sell him south. So he knew, and he was already working it out in his head how to get out of this. And the 2 men that were with him, he must have told them something, because right when they got to landing on the Boone County side, they scattered. And Abram himself took off and got a little skiff, which is a small rowboat. Those were often on the shore. He got in that boat and rowed across immediately. And I think in the chaos of the 3 people running in different directions, he fared the best, and he escaped, and the other 2 were caught. What he did with his head start is he got into that deep brush on the side of the river. I don't know how far away from the river he went, but he was able to hide until dark. And my goodness, this man crossed back into Kentucky to say goodbye to his family. And he had a wife and 2 small children. And so he came back over to Kentucky to say goodbye to them and possibly promise to come get them again, which is often how it went. It's very hard to travel with children, and he would have had more luck making it on his own. And so he went over and said his goodbyes. And then I consider it as an escape again when he crossed back across that Ohio River. He did get recaptured on the Indiana side of the river very soon after crossing again, but he beat down his pursuers and took off. And they caught up to him. And then this time they decided, because he had gotten the best of them, that they would put him on a horse between them. They were on horses and he was on a horse in the center. And they figured there's no way he would get away. I don't know if his hands were tied. His feet probably weren't, because he was sitting astride a horse, but his hands may have been secured. But he was on that horse, and he decided that once they reached what he called a good gait, meaning pretty fast, he abruptly stopped, and he probably jumped off the back of that horse, and he ran and escaped into the woods. And for 7 weeks he hid, and he went all the way to Goshen, Indiana. And I have a slide that shows you how far that was, but that's a long time to be hiding and pursued on your own. There's some indication he had some help here and there, told where to go. And then once he was in Goshen, he learned that he was still being pursued. So he had some information that someone shared with him about that. So he then left Goshen and fled to Canada, because he was told this was the only place that they couldn't touch him in terms of the law. And so he fled to Canada, and he was kind of back and forth between Canada and Detroit for many years. And you see, by 1858, so this is 9 years after he escaped, he settled finally in Howell, Michigan. And so that really is his escape journey, lasting 9 years, because he never really got settled, and he probably was unsettled because he didn't feel safe. And so I wanted to put this together to kind of show you how far he went. So I don't know how easy it is to see, but down in Boone County, you see those arrows going back and forth across the Ohio. That's because he crossed the river a few times. He escaped the first time, went back to see his family, and then crossed again. And I consider that his second escape. And then he traveled after escaping from those men again, jumping off the horse, escape number 3. He traveled about 265 miles and landed in Goshen. That's where he ended that leg of his journey, where he rested a little bit, but it's really only about halfway, because he traveled another 214 miles when he heard he was being pursued. And that got him to Canada West. And then he came back over to Detroit. So he crossed the Ohio River 3 times and the Detroit River twice, at least that we know of. He probably went back and forth more times than that, because it's right there at Detroit. And then somehow made his way to Howell, Michigan, which is not far from Detroit, but that's yet another 60 miles. That whole trip is, 560 miles-ish, which is a really long trip. So he, and if you look at the evasive tactics that I mentioned in the bottom right of the screen, that bold action that he took was when he, fought his pursuers off physically, and then was recaptured and got up to a really good gait, which is either a fast trot or a canter, and threw himself off that horse and took off again. That's bold. It was also bold to jump in that rowboat and row across the river. That was also bold. Going across to see his family, bold. This man is bold, bold, bold. But he also mentioned in his escape that he, I know in movies and TV shows, we often see people going in creeks and rivers to throw the dogs off the scent. Well, his tactic was to smear cow dung on his feet or shoes. If he had shoes, I don't know if he did, but anyway, he stepped in cow dung and kept doing that when he was on his trip, because that would definitely throw them off the scent. And that's pretty smart. Okay, so obituaries. Now you can kind of see my path. I learned about him through this obituary that mentioned his eventful career, the number 1 up there on the top left, Uncle Abe Losford. These are from a paper in Howell. And again, as I told you, we have his picture because he was a fixture in that community for many, many years. He lived there until he died in 1897. So he was there for about 40 years, almost 40 years. And so they tell a lot of details about his escape in this obituary, but also talk about him and his life in Howell. And during this search that I was doing in newspapers, I also got a hit on that number 2 little snippet I have there about Charles Straws. That name had never come up in my research for Boone County, for people who were enslaved in Boone County. And so that was new to me. And it's spelled straws like a drinking straw, but it's also spelled like Strauss, depending on what you're looking at. And so this came up because it had a philosopher's name in it. And Charlie Strauss was the nephew of Abe. So I have a new family connection there. I knew that Abe had 2 children. He actually returned to Boone County after the end of actually probably after the end of 1865, and he got his children and brought them back with him. His wife had died during the years that he was away. And so he did get his children. Their names were Benjamin and Sarah, and he brought them back to Howell with him. Charlie Strauss, apparently the extended family came to Howell because Charlie was there. And it says he ran away at the close of the rebellion. Now, I'm sure you all know, because we're in Kentucky, that the Civil War, the Emancipation Proclamation, nor the Civil War did not free Kentucky slaves. That didn't happen until December of 1865. So he ran away at the close of the rebellion and came to Howell to be with his family, probably his uncle. He knew he was there. And then I found, searching for Mr. Strauss, I found his brother, Scott. And Scott Strauss died the same year Abraham did. But I would not have seen that had I not come across this Strauss name. So now I have Charles and Scott. Now, who's their mom? Who are these people? And how can I find the rest of the family? And I found in the Boone County and Strauss were the keywords that I used. I found Mr. and Mrs. Calvert, who were once married in Boone County while they were both enslaved. Mr. Calvert was, or Mrs. Calvert, excuse me, was a sister of Charles Strauss. So now we have 3 children. We have Charles Scott and this Mrs. Strauss, who you'll see in later research, her name is Lena. And these are the nephews and niece of Abe Losford, but we don't know how. Is it a brother? Is it a sister? Who connects him? So we're leaning into our genealogy. So I looked for the 1870 census first to see the very first, that's always the jumping off point for enslaved people to find them in official records. That's often the place where they appear only for the first time. And I see the household of James Calvert and his wife, Lena. With them are her children, George and Florence, who are from a previous marriage. And that gave me another last name, which was Sebastian. So she was married twice while enslaved. Her first husband was a Sebastian, and her second husband was James Calvert. And then I see also in the household a woman named Sarah Strauss, which is Strauss, and her son Scott. So there is Scott Strauss that we already knew about. He's with his sister's family and his mother. And I assume that's the mother by the last name and the age, but I need to make sure. So I wanted to go back and search around a little bit more. Through George and Florence's records, I learned that their father's name was William Sebastian. So I have a few names there that'll be helpful. So luckily, Ancestry did a little work for me on this one and linked Scott's birth record from 1853 to him. And I went, there's a Scott and there's a Sarah. He's exactly the right age. Is that right? And I knew who William Kirtley was because he's a Boone County enslaver. And I knew the Kirtley family well. We actually looked at a Kirtley earlier. They are connected through family. So the man who enslaved Moody was related to this William Kirtley. And another child that came up in these birth records was a child named Marshall, but the mother's name was not there. So at this point, I didn't know how Marshall fit into the picture. But I did have a little local knowledge of the Kirtley family. So thanks to that connection with Scott's birth record, it took me to look a little bit more at William Kirtley. And lucky for us, he died before the end of the Civil War. So there was an inventory that named all of the enslaved people held by him in 1863 when he died. And we see, and I tried to make this as simple as I could, it's very complicated, but if you look at the top, Sarah, who was the mother of these children, Scott, Charles, and Lena, that we learned about in Howell, Michigan, she shows up in that 1870 census. And again, there's a Sarah who's the mother in the birth record of Scott. And so we see in this inventory, Charlie, and we see Sarah, and we see Lena, who is the sister, and we see Scott. So Sarah and her 3 boys. And then remember that Lena had an earlier husband. She was actually grown with children of her own at the time this inventory was done. And there's a Bill, who may be William Sebastian. We also see Florence and George. And then remember Marshall, who was born in 1854. Marshall's on this record too. So I don't know if his mother is Lena or not, but I'm thinking he might be based on this inventory. So you guys seeing that I'm going sideways with my genealogy because I still don't know who was the enslaver of Abraham Losford, and I'm not sure how to connect these people quite yet. All right. The Kirtleys were one of a rare family that actually documented slave births in their family Bible. And they have some documentation here of Sally, who was born in 1819. Now, if you remember that 1870 census, she's 52. If you do the math, it matches up pretty well. Sally is the daughter of Rebecca, and Sally is Sarah, who shows up later in the inventory. There are a few more connections here, but not direct to that family. Isaac is a son of Sally, and he was born in 1836, which tracks with some of the siblings, but I don't know what happened to him. I don't have a death documented for him, so we don't know exactly who he was. There is a connection between the Kirtley family and the Johnson family in Boone County. They both were located in the North Bend, which is that very northernmost hump of the county. And Cave Johnson's house is still standing. There is a slave dwelling that is still there. Cave Johnson's daughter was married to William Kirtley. There was a lot of trading back and forth of enslaved people between these families. Cave Johnson often got himself into debt, but when he was flush, he'd buy slaves. So, it was back and forth, back and forth. It's very hard to trace his enslaved people because of all this, movement among the people. Now, Sally is a year or so, anywhere from a year to 10 years older than Abraham, but she is a sister. I don't know if Abraham was enslaved by Cave Johnson or not, but it appears that Cave Johnson, he died in 1850 and he died deeply in debt. And this was one of many periods of debt where he was selling slaves for a couple of years before he died. And that tracks with the 1849 date. So it's possible that he was selling Abraham and 2 other people to recoup some of his debt. They were right next door to the Kirtleys, so it makes sense that they would be there. I don't know where the name Losford comes in, but we'll talk about that. Here's a photo of the Cave Johnson house's slave dwelling. This is where, this is actually one of the nicer, more sturdy buildings that I've seen. It does have a loft level and several families would have lived here. All right, now, I'm sure that those of you who use Ancestry recognize on the right-hand side that that is a piece of a family tree that I had going for Abraham, trying to figure him out. There is a lot of tradition in this family, but there's a lot of confusion. The naming tradition is interesting because Abraham's 2 nephews and niece have a mother named Sarah, and he has a daughter named Sarah from his first wife and his second wife. It gets very confusing. So I think Sarah Losford is his sister. I think she was probably referred to as Sarah something, who knows, but she got married and she became, Sarah Straws. So she may have been a Losford first. And so I think she is the connection to those 2 nephews and a niece. His wife, according to his children's records, was either Elizabeth or Rosanna. Sarah is his first daughter and his first son is Benjamin. They both ended up in Howell, Michigan. His second wife was also Sarah. Can you believe it? And so those are the children they shared. One was an adopted child. The rest were natural children. And the youngest of which was also named Sarah. So we have 4 Sarahs here, and it's very confusing. But I know you all are good at genealogy. You can handle it. So that naming tradition was definitely there. Another tradition in this family was barbering. So Abraham was a barber in town in Howell, which is how he became so well known. As we all know, we spend some time in that chair. You get to know that person pretty well. And his son was then trained as a barber. So Benjamin also became a barber. Benjamin's son, Norman, also a barber. Abraham's daughter, Sally, was a hairstylist. And her husband, Samuel Anderson, who she married later, was a barber. Scott Straws and Charles Straws, barbers. So these people were doing some hair in this family. And I love seeing that because it shows not only the tradition in their family, but it shows a closeness that they would probably they were being apprenticed to family members to learn their trade. So I found that really interesting. And the genealogy gold with the story, there's way more to it. We don't have enough time. But starting with Abraham's obituary that included the escape story, was really the beginning of investigating this family. And the fact that he stayed in Howell for so long gave me more information. Those extended family connections gave me more than I could find from his own children. So that helped me trace some things back in Boone County. And I think the naming tradition does help to identify Sarah as his sister. Having the local knowledge that I have of Boone County did help quite a bit, because I knew to go to those Kirtley Bibles, those primary sources that are really only available in Boone County. They're still not all digitized yet, but that does help to have. If you don't have local knowledge of the locality where you're researching someone, then find the person who does, because boy, does that save some time, and I'm sure you all know that. Using your genealogy skills is the only way to confirm everything. And that includes investigating the enslaving families and learning those connections, like William Kirtley was Cape Johnson's son-in-law. And as we know, that's the devil's in the details. You got to find them. And I think that you all probably are pretty experienced and know that even in any straight genealogy, you've got to go that way to get all that information. And so just the takeaways that I have for you all today is I like to stress that Boone County's location was important in the Underground Railroad, because it was a crossing point, and that it's no mistake that the Freedom Center is placed where it was, because there was so much Underground Railroad traffic through this area. And that was the first stop for freedom there. I do think that paying attention to those instances that cause people to run away are important. Almost always it's the threat of being sold away from family, sold to the Deep South with harsh conditions. Understanding and acknowledging self-emancipation and the agency of the people who escaped is at the top of my list, because I think they often get lost in the discussion. There's always this white hero that comes along and saves people, but that's not the case. People had to do the first and most dangerous step of leaving enslavement. Learning enough about humans and telling their story in a way that that we understand them as people, and if you're telling it to other people as an audience, that they also understand the humanity of everyone who's involved in these events. Knowing the local information is important, checking for accuracy, and doing that sideways genealogy, the extended family, sometimes is the only way to get there. And those genealogical skills that you have are definitely priceless. I'm sure I don't have to tell you that I love newspapers, because they were throughout this presentation, but I also think it's important to have an open mind. I don't know if any of you are sticklers for details and get stuck because the name spelling is off a little, or the years are off a little, or you know someone who gets stuck that way. But I always try to encourage that open mind, because things do get, they do get lost in translation sometimes, and names get misspelled or change, and birth dates are sometimes off. But if we keep an open mind and try to creatively solve some of these questions, then I think we'll get there. And I would love to hear any feedback you all have about some of the things that have worked best for you. I learn every time I talk to people about this, so I'm looking forward to what you can share with me.